Settle in and dim the lights. Tonight, we're riding along with a quiet kid from Staten Island who grows up to sit beside a very powerful man, steering through dockyards, hilltop mansions, and midtown streets, all the way to a winter evening outside a famous steakhouse. This is a calm mob history sleep story about loyalty, family, and the price of standing too close to the boss, told softly so you can drift towards sleep while the city keeps moving outside the window. Before we begin, if you're still awake in a minute or two, I'd love to know where you're listening from. In the comments, share your local time and whether you're in a small town kitchen, a city apartment, or on the night shift at work. Now take a slow breath, get comfortable, and let's begin the story of the man beside the boss, Tommy Bilotti. Chapter 1: Staten Island Beginnings. On Staten Island in the years after the war, mornings often began with the smell of coffee strong enough to wake the whole block. In the Bilotti apartment, that smell came with the sound of voices, overlapping in Italian and English, trying their best to agree on what the weather felt like and who owed who a favor this week. Tommy grew up in that noise, a kid with dark hair, sharp eyes, and a habit of listening even when he looked like he was not. The building was old but sturdy, with stairways that creaked in complaint and windows that rattled when the harbour wind came up from the water. From his bedroom, Tommy could hear ship horns in the distance, long, low notes that sounded like someone clearing a giant throat. The harbour was his first clock. Long before he wore a watch, he knew the rhythm of the day by the sounds of the docks. He was not the biggest kid in the neighbourhood, but he moved with a kind of compact determination. When other boys chased each other in the street, Tommy often hung back, watching, waiting until the game had some kind of structure. He did not care for chaos. He liked to know who was on which side, what the score was, and what the rules were, even if the rules were made up on the spot. At home, his mother ran the kitchen with the authority of a general and the patience of a saint. Pots simmered from morning till night. Tomato, garlic, onion, and oil turned the tiny apartment into a restaurant that never closed. Tommy saw how his mother handled problems. She never raised her voice, but somehow everyone ended up doing what she wanted. "You want to understand real power," her quiet manner seemed to say. "Watch who controls the plates and the serving spoon." His father was a softer presence, a man who came home smelling of work and smoke, who sat at the table with a tired smile and a steady appetite. He talked less than the other men, but when he did speak, the kids listened. There were stories about Sicily, about crossing an ocean, about bosses back there and bosses here. The names changed, the accents shifted, but the lessons stayed the same. Life was about knowing who you stood behind. The neighborhood itself was an education. On every block there were men who never seemed to hurry, who always had time for a coffee or a slow walk around the corner. Their suits were a little nicer, their shoes shined a little brighter. They did not punch a clock, yet their bills were paid. People spoke about them in lowered tones, not in fear exactly, but in respect. The sort of respect that comes when you understand that these are not men you keep waiting. As a boy, Tommy carried groceries, ran errands, delivered notes that were folded twice and sealed with nothing more than a nod. He learned early that a small favour done quickly was worth more than a large favour done late. When he knocked on doors and said that so-and-so sent him, people smiled, patted his shoulder and pressed a tip into his hand. This was his first real subject in the quiet school of the streets. On summer evenings, the adults set up chairs on the sidewalk and turned the block into a talking room under the open sky. Tommy would drift at the edge of the conversation. From one chair he heard talk of baseball, from another of rent and repairmen. But from a few chairs near the corner came a different tone, low and measured, full of words like situation, arrangement, and obligation. Those words interested him. They were doors that adults closed in a kid's face, and Tommy never forgot which doors were closed. Staten Island in those days felt like a world in between. It was not quite the city, not quite the suburbs. You could see Manhattan from certain spots on a clear day, a skyline that looked like something from another planet. To Tommy, it might as well have been the capital of a foreign country. He knew that day he would cross that water not just as a visitor, but as someone who belonged on both sides. He was not a perfect child, though his mother liked to pretend he was when relatives came over. He had a temper that flared quickly and cooled slowly. If someone cheated in a game, he reacted with more intensity than the situation really required. More than once his father pulled him aside and told him to breathe, to count, to remember that not every insult is a life and death matter. To Tommy it was not about pride, it was about the rules. Once you agreed to rules, he thought, everybody should follow them. School was something he endured rather than enjoyed. The teachers talked about history, geography, and algebra. Tommy saw value in some of it, but it all seemed far away from the real scoreboard he watched every day. The principal did not decide who got respect on the block. The report cards did not change who could walk into the corner cafe and have a drink waiting without asking. He did enough to get by, nothing more, and kept his real attention focused on the world outside the windows. There was an old cafe at the end of his street, the doors painted a tired shade of green that never seemed to peel. The same men sat at the same tables day after day, playing cards, drinking coffee, reading papers. Tommy noticed who greeted who first, who picked up the check, who everyone turned to when a disagreement started. He began to understand that power was as much about posture and patience as it was about money. The man who spoke last was often the who made the decision. By his early teens, the errands grew more serious. He was asked to keep an eye on a parked car, to pass along messages not just folded but handwritten with neat care. Sometimes the envelope had weight to it. He never peeked inside, that was the rule. You delivered the envelope, you collected the nod or the pat on the cheek, and that was the end of the story. It would have been easy to be scared, but Tommy felt something different. He felt useful. In a neighborhood where a lot of people drifted from one small job to another, being useful to the right people carried a quiet glow. It meant that when he walked down the block, certain faces lit up. People would say, "There goes the Bilotti kid, he gets things done." The first time he rode one of the big sedans that everyone watched with careful eyes, he sat in the back and tried to look smaller than he was. The seat was soft, the air smelled like cologne and leather, and the man beside him talked about small things, weather and baseball, and a cousin visiting from Brooklyn. But underneath the small talk, Tommy felt the weight of that ride. This was not a family visit. This was a test. He passed it quietly. He said little, listened a lot, and when the man asked him if he understood the importance of being on time, he answered with more seriousness than most boys his age could manage. The man smiled, a brief approval that meant more to Tommy than any gold star at school. The car dropped him back at his corner, and as he stepped out he felt taller. As the years shifted, his path slowly bent toward the shadowed side of neighborhood life. There was no single moment where he signed a form or made a speech, no ceremony, no dramatic oaths. Just 1,000 small choices that edged him closer to one set of men and further from another. The kids who once played stickball with him now worked in shops or yards. Tommy's work could not be explained in a sentence. His mother still asked if he was eating enough, if he was dressing warm enough, if he was staying away from trouble. He answered with affectionate lies, careful not to bring the outside world too close to her kitchen table. His father watched him more quietly, sometimes with a hint of worry and sometimes with a look that said he recognized the road his son was walking. It was a road older than Staten Island, older than the harbor, a road that ran through villages across the sea and through tenement blocks across the boroughs. On a cold evening in his late teens, standing by the water with the wind cutting through his coat, Tommy realized that any ordinary life had quietly slipped away from him. He did not feel regret. He felt a kind of stubborn acceptance. The boats came and went, lights blinking in the dark, and he understood that some people were meant to cross water while others stayed on the dock. He knew which cunt he wanted to be. Days turned into routines. Mornings began with quick calls and assignments, meet this person, drive that package, pick up that envelope. Nights ended in the same cafe, with the same men, where the conversations always carried more meaning than the words alone. Tommy spoke less and less, yet somehow found himself invited into more and more private circles. Before he truly realized it, he was no longer the kid running for coffee. He was the one younger boys watched from the edge of the room, trying to read his face, trying to guess which side of his temper they would see that day. Respect had arrived not with fanfare but like a slow tide, and it came tied tight to responsibility. He knew, somewhere inside, that this life would not give him a quiet retirement. Men who did what he did either climbed or they vanished. There was not much middle ground. Yet the thought did not scare him. If anything, it focused him. If the game had high stakes, then there was a certain honor in playing it well. On Staten Island, the streets where he had once played now felt smaller under his shoes. He walked them like routes on a map he had already memorized. The harbour still groaned and whispered in the distance, and the ship horns still blew their long, slow notes. For Tommy, those sounds no longer signalled just another day. They sounded like a countdown, slow but steady, to something larger. He did not know it yet, but his path was bending toward a man on a hill, a house with heavy carpets, and a future in which he would spend more time behind the wheel of a sleek car than in any classroom or shop. That future waited just across the water, reflecting in the skyscraper lights he could see on clear nights. For now, though, he was still the Staten Island kid, the Bilotti boy who carried himself with more seriousness than his age should allow, who understood favours better than algebra and loyalty better than geography. The city might have been huge, but his world was small and dense and full of unspoken laws, and he was learning how to live inside them with his head held high. Chapter 2: Waterfront Lessons. The docks at dawn were their own country. The air smelled like salt and diesel, like ropes left wet too long and crates that had crossed oceans. Tommy's day often started there now, stepping out of a car while the sky was still a deep navy shade, with only a line of pale grey at the horizon hinting that morning was coming. Men in heavy coats moved with sleepy purpose, shouting just loud enough to be heard over the grind of engines and the clatter of chains. Some were union men, some were not, and some were something in between, depending on who was asking. Tommy learned to tell them apart not by badges but by posture. The ones on the payroll walked with a certain confidence. The others watched everything a little too carefully. He was not unloading cargo. That was not his job. His work was to make sure certain shipments moved smoothly, that certain supervisors stayed in a good mood, that small disputes never got big enough for anyone official to notice. He became a messenger and a presence, someone who appeared at the edge of a disagreement and gently reminded everyone involved that there were better days to fight over. He liked the water. It felt honest. Waves came in, waves went out, and did not pretend to be anything other than what they were. The business around the docks, on the other hand, was built on layers. A truck was late because of traffic, a crate was missing because of a paperwork mix-up, a supervisor changed his mind because the numbers did not add up. Everyone had reasons. Tommy's job was not to argue with the reasons. His job was to remind them that some outcomes were non-negotiable. There was always coffee. Small chipped cups, steam curling up into cold air, hands wrapped around the warmth. Deals were made over those cups. Apologies were accepted. Short-term truces were arranged. Tommy noticed that the men who made the biggest decisions rarely raised their voices. They sat at a crate or leaned against a railing, spoke softly, and watched as the others carried their words into action. He spent more time now as a driver and a kind of mobile assistant to these men. The waterfront was only one stop in a long daily loop that took him from Staten Island to Brooklyn, sometimes into Manhattan, sometimes back again in circles that looked random from the outside but were anything but. He had become part of the machinery that kept certain businesses humming smoothly without official inspection. In the car he developed a routine. Before picking up a higher-up, he checked the mirrors, the gas, the glove compartment, the lines of sight along the route. He knew which roads tended to clog, which corners offered too many hiding spots, which traffic lights were timed in your favor if you hit them at just the right speed. To others, he was just a guy behind the wheel. To Tommy, the car was a moving office, and he was responsible for everything that happened inside and around it. Some of the men he drove treated him like part of the furniture, a quiet fixture who handled doors and ran quick errands. Others talked to him. They offered bits of advice, test questions, little stories that carried lessons without ever calling themselves lessons. One told him that the trick in life was to know when to be invisible and when to be impossible to ignore. Another told him that loyalty was like a bank. You made deposits with small favors, so that when the day came you needed to withdraw, your account was not empty. Tommy listened. He chose when to respond carefully. He was not a clown, not a chatterbox. He had opinions, but he knew that the people in the back seat did not need his commentary on the weather or the ball game unless they asked. What they needed was reliability. Pick up when they called, show up 5 minutes early, know when to turn the radio down and when to fade it out completely. On some days he drove through rain so heavy the wipers could barely keep up. On others the sun turned the city into a glare of glass and steel. Seasons changed, but the routine remained. He picked off envelopes, dropped off packages, waited in parked cars outside restaurants where long lunches stretched into dusk. The names on his schedule grew more important over time. So did the weight of the things he carried. With responsibility came attention. Younger guys in the neighborhood started asking him for small favors. Could he put in a word with this person? Could he help smooth over a misunderstanding with that? Tommy realized that he had become a bridge between levels, the kid from the block who now had access to rooms that most of his old friends only heard about in whispers. He did not let it go to his head, at least not in public. Pride, he knew, could be dangerous. It made you careless. But in private moments, when he parked the car on a bluff and looked at the skyline shining across the water, he allowed himself a quiet satisfaction. He was no longer just watching the game, he was playing a role, even if it remained in the shadows. Of course, his temper came along for the ride. Once, when a dock worker spoke to him with a little too much sarcasm, Tommy's voice sharpened. The air suddenly went still around them. Another man, older and more experienced, stepped in quickly, clapping a hand on Tommy's shoulder and steering him aside. Later, that older man told him calmly that in their line of work, losing your cool in front of strangers was like throwing your cards on the table before anyone had placed a bet. Tommy took the rebuke seriously. He did not want to be known as a hothead who created problems. He wanted to be known as someone who solved them. So he worked on it. He learned to squeeze his temper into a cold, hard focus, saving it for moments when a measured show of intensity was needed and when it would have the right audience. The waterfront world liked men who got things done. It did not have much patience for dreamers. Tommy found a strange comfort in that. There were no essays to write, no exams. The tests came in the form of unexpected complications. A shipment damaged, a supervisor suddenly worried about an inspection, a driver who failed to show. Each problem came without warning, and each time he found a way to adjust, his stock rose a little higher. Through all this, Staten Island remained his anchor. He still went home there, still walked the same streets at night, still stopped into the same cafe where the coffee never changed. But even that place felt different now. When he stepped inside, conversations dipped for a heartbeat before resuming. Men he had once looked up to now nodded at him as an equal. He built his own quiet style, not flashy, not loud. His suits fit well but did not shout for attention. His shoes were polished but not ostentatious. He preferred solid colors, straightforward lines. If you saw him across the room, you might not notice him first, but if you spent a little time watching, you would see how often people drifted his way, how many times someone leaned in to murmur something in his ear. Behind the wheel, he was precise. He signaled when he did not have to. He left space between his car and the one in front. He parked in spots that offered a quick exit if needed. He disliked surprises on the road. Every block held potential risk, and he trained himself to scan for it without looking paranoid. On one particular morning, grey and cold, he was sent to pick up a man he had only seen from a distance before. A man whose name carried weight on Staten Island and beyond. The instructions were clear. Be on time, be respectful, pay attention. Tommy felt that familiar tightening in his chest, that alertness that came with an important assignment. He brushed imaginary dust off his coat and checked his tie in the rearview mirror before stepping out to open the door. The man got in without hurry, glancing briefly at Tommy as if measuring him. They drove in silence for several blocks. Then the man asked in a mild voice how long Tommy had been driving for the group. Tommy answered simply, giving years as words, not numbers, keeping his tone steady. The questions that followed were not really about driving. They were about reliability, about what he had seen, about what he understood, and more importantly, what he knew enough to ignore. By the time they reached their destination, something unspoken had passed between them, a small approval, like a stamp on an invisible form. Tommy could feel it. When he held the door and the man stepped out, there was a slightly warmer nod, the kind a busy person gives when they decide to remember your name. That was how it went. No promotions from a human resources office, no certificates on a wall, just more frequent calls, heavier envelopes, and seats at closer tables. The waterfront brought him into contact with men whose operations stretched far beyond the docks. One of those men, quiet but unmistakably powerful, lived on a hill on Staten Island in a house that looked more like a suburban dream than a criminal headquarters. Tommy heard his name more often now. Big Paul. Mr. Castellano. Some said the name with admiration, others with the careful cadence of those afraid to show how they really felt. For Tommy, the name represented a direction. Up the hill, into a house with soft rugs and thick curtains, into a new level of responsibility. Before he reached that hill, though, he refined his craft on the streets, in the port, and behind the wheel. He learned when to be a shadow and when to step forward. He learned that the city did not care who you thought you were. They cared who could move things, settle disputes, and keep promises. By that measure, he was doing well. And yet, in quiet moments at night, when the harbour lights blinked like sleepy eyes and the city noise faded to a distant hum, he would sometimes remember himself as a boy, carrying groceries up those creaking stairs, listening to the adults talk about bosses and obligations. He had not wandered far from those conversations. He had simply stepped inside them. The waterfront had taught him many things, but the most important was simple. In his world, loyalty was a full-time occupation, and the road ahead would only demand more of it. As the calls from higher up the chain grew more frequent, he knew that the next phase of his life was coming. The hill, the house, and the man at the top were no longer distant images. They were destinations he was being quietly steered toward, and he was ready to take the wheel. Chapter 3: Meeting Big Paul. The first time Tommy drove up Todt Hill, the car seemed to feel it. The engine hummed a little different on the incline, and the world around them changed from tight city streets to broad, quiet roads lined with big houses and wide lawns. Staten Island did not have many hills that felt important. This did. People spoke about it in lowered voices, as if elevation alone gave it authority. Tommy kept his hand steady on the wheel. The instructions had been simple. Pick up the boss. Be early, not on time. Do not make him wait. That was all, no long speech about protocol. In this world, some rules were too obvious to spell out. The house was large without being ostentatious, brick and stone, with a tall fence and a gate that made a clear point. It was not a palace, but it was not any regular family home either. The driveway curved gently, forcing cars to slow down before they reached the door. A smart detail, Tommy thought. You never wanted someone arriving too fast. He parked where he had been told to park and sat for a moment, listening to the tick of the cooling engine and his own heartbeat. He was not nervous exactly, but he was aware that this was not a dock supervisor or a neighborhood captain. This was the man whose decisions rippled across boroughs, whose signature could move money and men with a kind of quiet force. A houseman came down the steps, nodded once, and said the boss would be right out. Tommy got out of the car, smoothed his coat, and checked the line of his tie with a quick touch. The morning air had a cool bite, and the silence of the neighborhood felt heavy, as if every house along the road was watching. When Paul Castellano stepped out, he did not rush. He was a large man, but he carried himself with a measured dignity that made every step seem deliberate. His clothes were good, better than good, but not loud. The kind of expensive that just looked right without calling attention to itself. Tommy opened the rear door and kept his eyes respectfully low but not weak. There was a balance to strike. You did not stare, but you did not act like a frightened kid either. The boss glanced at him, a short moment, long enough to register his face, his posture, the way his hands moved. Then Castellano settled into the seat, and the houseman closed the door with a soft thump. The ride began in silence. Tommy eased the car down the drive, out past the gate and onto the main road. The city waited at the bottom of the hill, a soft grey sprawl beneath a pale sky. In the mirror he could see a sliver of the boss's reflection. Large frame, thoughtful eyes, expression unreadable. After a few blocks, Castellano spoke. Not a grand speech, just a simple question. How long have you been driving? Tommy answered with dates in words careful and calm. A few years here, some more years there. He mentioned the waterfront, the late nights, the fact that so far he had not managed to lose any passengers or miss any appointments. It was an attempt at humour, small and self-deprecating. The boss gave the smallest hint of a smile. It was not much, but it felt like sunlight finding a tiny crack in a wall. He asked another question. This was about Tommy's family, where they lived, how many kids, how his parents were. He listened to the answers with the calm attention of a man who knew that understanding a person's home life was part of understanding their reliability. As they crossed the bridge, the skyline spread out ahead of them. From the driver's seat, Tommy saw buildings he had only glimpsed as a boy. Now he was steering a car that carried one of the men who had a say in what happened behind some of those windows. They drove through Brooklyn traffic that rolled and snarled like a restless animal. Tommy kept a safe distance, signaled, changed lanes with confidence but without showing off. In the back seat, Castellano read papers, made a few brief calls, and occasionally looked out the window with the thoughtful expression of a man calculating things no one else could see. By midday they had moved through 2 meetings in quiet offices where the carpet swallowed footfalls, and the coffee tasted like it had never met a diner pot in its life. Tommy stayed where he belonged. Hallways, doorways, just inside or just outside, close enough if needed, far enough not to intrude. In those hallways he saw how people reacted when the boss arrived. Men who had seemed important a moment earlier suddenly looked like students waiting for a teacher. There were handshakes, pleased smiles, the kind of respectful laughter that came a half-second too quickly. Tommy watched closely. He noted who looked truly at ease and who kept stealing anxious glances at the clock. The day passed in a quiet whirl. The car moved from street to street, address to address, like a small ship guided through familiar channels. By the time they headed back towards Staten Island, the sun was leaning low, turning windows into sheets of gold. On the drive home, Castellano spoke again, more casually this time. He made a few dry comments about the meetings, observations that carried both wit and steel. He asked Tommy what he thought of a certain neighborhood they had passed through. Tommy's reply was simple, nothing bold, but it showed he paid attention. He mentioned which blocks looked like they were waking up, which storefronts had changed hands, where the traffic had thickened over the past few years. The boss nodded, as if adding that small report to a mental ledger. Then he said something that surprised Tommy. He told him that a driver who noticed things was better than a driver who just watched the light ahead. In this life, he said, a man who can see the whole street is worth more than a man who only sees his own lane. It was not a long speech, but it stayed with Tommy. He realized that this was his first real lesson from the man on the hill. A driver, in Castellano's world, was more than hands and feet on pedals and wheel. He was eyes, ears, and, if he proved himself, a trusted extension of the boss's will. Over the following weeks the assignments continued. Sometimes he drove for others, as before, but increasingly his phone rang with instructions to bring the car to Todt Hill. Each time he arrived at the house, the gate opened a little faster, the houseman's nod a little more familiar. He began to notice details inside the house too, the heavy carpets that dulled every step, the framed pictures on the walls, some of family, some of dignified gatherings where men in suits stood in neat rows. The kitchen smelled like wealth and comfort. like good meat and rich sauces, a home built for the long game, not for quick grabs. In the presence of the boss, Tommy's natural seriousness fit well. Castellano liked order, schedules, routines that worked exactly as planned. Tommy provided that with his driving. He came early, he waited without complaint. He never needed to be told twice which route to avoid at certain hours. In the car he learned the rhythm of Castellano's moods. Some days the boss wanted quiet, just the hum of the engine and the city outside. Other days he talked. Not confessions, not secrets, just observations. The price of meat. The state of unions. A court case that amused or annoyed him. Tommy responded sparingly, choosing his words with care. Occasionally a note of light humour slipped through. Castellano's sarcasm was dry, almost gentle. He would remark on a politician's sudden moral awakening with a soft snort, or on a rival's unfortunate fashion sense with a quiet aside. Tommy found himself smiling at those remarks, careful to keep his eyes on the road and his laughter respectful. Slowly a pattern formed. Tommy was no longer but a driver borrowed from the waterfront world. He was becoming part of the Todt Hill routine. That change rippled outward. On Staten Island, people noticed that his car was seen more often at the big house. Men in cafes began to treat him not only as a man who got things done, but as a man who spent his days in the orbit of Big Paul. With that new standing came more responsibility. He was sometimes asked to deliver messages not in envelopes but in person. Quiet words passed along in private corners, phrased politely but carrying clear meaning. He was trusted to remember, to repeat accurately, to carry not only the content but the tone. He also learned the schedule of Castellano's family, when dinners were likely to be formal, when visits from relatives filled the house with noise, when the boss preferred not to be disturbed. Tommy adjusted his own life around those rhythms. His hours were not 9 to 5, they were whenever the man on the hill needed to move. On one chilly evening, after a particularly long day of driving and waiting, Tommy found himself alone in the parked car outside the house, watching his breath fog the windshield. The lights inside glowed warm against the dark. Voices drifted faintly through the glass. He thought about how far he had come from the kid carrying grocery bags up worn staircases. Yet he did not feel like an outsider looking in. He felt, in his own quiet way, like part of the structure. He was not at the dinner table, but he was the one who made sure the man at the head of that table could travel safely between worlds. In this life, that counted. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months. Some faces around the boss stayed constant, others came and went. Tommy paid attention. He noticed who pushed too hard for attention and who hung back with patient confidence. He saw which names made Castellano's mouth tighten, which ones drew a rare, approving nod. Through it all, he kept his place, not trying to speak like a top man, not pretending to know more than he did. Yet, when asked for an opinion on something simple, he gave it honestly but respectfully. That balance was tricky. Too much eagerness could look like ambition, too little could look like dullness. He walked the line with careful steps. Eventually, within the family's quiet hierarchy, a simple truth became obvious. Tommy was not only reliable, he was loyal, fully, almost stubbornly. If he was given a task, he did it. If he was trusted with information, it stayed where it belonged. His loyalty built on the lessons of his childhood, on the understanding that in a world of shifting alliances, picking a side and staying on it could be its own kind of power. One afternoon, as they drove back from a meeting in Brooklyn, Castellano spoke in a tone that was almost reflective. He said that a man could have all the talent in the world, but without loyalty, he was an accident waiting to happen. Then he added, almost offhand, that he appreciated people who understood that simple truth. Tommy did not answer with a speech. He just nodded, eyes on the road, the bridge rising ahead of them. Inside, though, the words settled like a weight in his chest. He understood that this was more than a casual remark. It was a marker, a statement of what the boss valued, and a quiet acknowledgement that Tommy was meeting that standard. From that point on, he did not just drive for Big Paul. He began to shape his whole identity around the job. Where he went, who he spoke with, what he allowed himself to say even in casual company. All of it was filtered through one question. Would this reflect well or poorly on the man he served? In a world where so many were scheming for a chance to move up, that kind of unwavering loyalty was rare. It made him dependable. It also made him vulnerable in ways he could not yet see. For the moment, though, on that hill, in that car, Tommy Bilotti had found his place. He sat behind the wheel, the city stretching ahead, the boss in the back seat, and the road between them as clear as it had ever been. Chapter 4: Family Man After Dark. For all the hours Tommy spent behind the wheel of expensive cars and in the shadow of Todt Hill, his life always circled back to a smaller, messier world. A world of school papers on the kitchen table, mismatched chairs, and a television that sometimes needed a slap on the side to fix the picture. Home was on Staten Island, not far from the streets where he had grown up, in a house that smelled of sauce on Sundays and laundry detergent on weekdays. His wife knew he worked hard. She also knew better than to ask too many questions about the shape of that work. Money came in regularly, bills were paid, the children had good shoes and warm coats. When neighbours asked what Tommy did, she had a standard line ready. He was in transportation, she said, or sometimes she said he helped manage deliveries and schedules. Both answers were technically true, which made them easier to repeat with a straight face. At home, Tommy wore softer clothes and a different expression. The tight focus he kept on the road relaxed a little. He let the kids climb on him when they were small, let them turn his arms into monkey bars and his lap into a fortress against the enemies in their cartoon shows. When the oldest brought home homework that made no sense, he pretended to help, squinting at math problems like they were encoded messages from another planet. There were nights when dinner was a full-table affair. Pasta, salad, bread, conversation bouncing from school gossip to family news. On those nights, Tommy tried to be fully present. He asked about tests, about playground dramas, about which teacher was too strict and which one was too soft. He did not always understand the details, but he knew the sound of children who felt safe enough to complain freely. That sound meant he was doing something right. The phone, of course, did not care about dinner. It rang when it wanted. Sometimes it rang just as the kids were arguing over dessert, sometimes when he was halfway through telling a story from his own childhood. The moment the ring cut through the room, a different sort of silence settled over the table. His wife would look at him. Their eyes would meet for a second. No drama, no accusation, just a shared understand. The job is calling. He would push his chair back, wipe his hands, and answer in his calm work voice. Short phrases, simple acknowledgements. Then he would get up, kiss each child on the head, and step into the bedroom to put on the suit jacket that never seemed to wrinkle. The children learned early that sometimes Daddy had to leave after dinner. Sometimes he missed school plays or weekend outings or birthday cakes. He tried, whenever he could, to balance the ledger. If he missed an event, he made sure to double down on being present at the next. He wanted his kids to remember him more for being there than for walking out the door. Still, double life was a tightrope. On afternoons when he picked them up from school, other parents sometimes gave him curious looks. He drove a nicer car than most. His clothes were a little sharper. His name occasionally turned up in whispers among the adults, whispers that stopped when he came within earshot. Tommy noticed but did not comment. He smiled in a polite, distant way, as if he were merely a man whose work hours were unusual, nothing more. In a neighborhood like his, people understood that not every job came with a business card. At home, he held certain lines firmly. He did not bring work-related conversations into the living room. He did not take sensitive calls within hearing of the kids. When he had to discuss something important, he stepped outside or sat in the car, the interior lit by the small dome light, his voice low and controlled. His wife was no fool. She grew up in similar streets, under similar unspoken rules. She recognized the type of life her husband was living. She also saw how he treated his family. He never forgot birthdays. He never came home with the wild eyes of a man who had lost control. He might return late, tired and quiet, but he still took out the trash, still fixed the leaky sink, still helped tuck the children into bed when timing allowed. When they argued, the disagreements were mostly ordinary. Missed dinners, long hours, a forgotten chore. The big question remained unspoken. She did not ask when he would leave this life, and he did not promise that it would ever be soon. Instead, they built a sort of peace around small rituals. Coffee together in the morning when he had no early run. A shared television show late at night, half watched, half ignored while they talked softly under its flickering light. There was a particular moment that stuck in his mind. One winter evening, after a day of driving in the city snow, he came home to find the kids building a crooked fortress out of couch cushions. They were shouting about imaginary attackers and heroic defenses. When he stepped through the door, boots heavy with slush, they greeted him like a returning general. He laughed, dropped his coat, and joined their game. For a little while, the fortress was under his command. The cushions became walls, the hallway a defensive trench. His wife watched from the doorway, arms crossed, smiling despite herself at the sight of the man who spent his days around power, now crawling on the floor to help a 6-year-old guard an imaginary bridge. That was the tightrope. Out there, he guarded a man whose name travelled across headlines. In here, he guarded a living room filled with scattered toys and school bags. Both jobs mattered to him. Both demanded their own kind of courage. On some nights, when everyone else was asleep, Tommy sat alone at the small kitchen table with a glass of wine. The house creaked softly. A clock ticked with stubborn regularity. He thought about the future, about his children growing up, about what kind of stories they would hear about their father. He knew the streets could be cruel in their judgments. Today's respected man could become tomorrow's cautionary tale. He hoped that, if people ever spoke his name to his children, they would at least say that he had been loyal, that he worked hard, that he tried to keep a respectful distance between his professional life and his family's safety. Of course, the two worlds could not remain completely separate. Gossip travelled. Every time there was a high-profile arrest or a loud headline, neighbours tested his wife with sideways looks. She learned to shrug those off with a practiced calm. On the rare occasions when someone asked too personal a question, she gently changed the subject with a joke or a compliment about their outfit. Tommy's reputation on the street grew quietly. For some, he was the guy who could get things fixed. For others, he was the man you did not want to disappoint. People did not usually call him to handle minor disputes. By the time his name entered a conversation, whoever was talking had already decided that this was a problem that needed serious attention. Despite that, he tried to remain approachable in his neighborhood. He greeted store owners, tipped well at the barber, remembered personal details about people's lives. Your son still playing bores? Your mother doing better? Those simple acknowledgements allowed him to walk the streets with less tension. The kids in the area watched him too, the way he carried himself, the way adults reacted around him. Some looked at him with admiration, others with a kind of wary curiosity. He saw future versions of himself in some of those boys, restless and serious, hungry for more than what regular jobs could offer. Part of him wanted to tell them to take the safer path. Another part knew that the streets would speak louder than any speech he could give. At home, his children were shielded from that side as much as possible. To them, he was just Dad, the one who brought home the occasional surprise dessert, who sometimes fell asleep in his chair with the television on, who knew exactly how to fix the crooked leg on a wobbly table. When they asked about the nice car, he said that his work required a lot of driving and that a good car made it easier. They accepted that explanation. Kids tend to accept what feels normal in their own house. On Sundays, when he could manage it, Tommy took the family for drives, not to fancy places, yet to parks, beaches, or to get ice cream. He drove differently on those days, slower, more relaxed. The tension in his shoulders eased. With the radio playing soft music and the kids arguing about which flavor was best, he could imagine, for short stretches, that he was just another man with a complicated but ordinary job. As his role beside Castellano grew, the time demands increased. There were more late nights, more sudden calls, more days when he left before sunrise and came back after midnight. His wife noticed the change. She saw the way he looked more tired, the faint lines deepening at the corners of his eyes. Sometimes she would ask in a quiet voice if things were getting more dangerous. He never lied outright, but he chose his words carefully. He would say that things were busier, that responsibilities had grown, that the circles he moved in were heavier. He would then shift the conversation toward practical topics, school schedules, bills, a needed repair on the car. In the privacy of his own mind, he admitted that the stakes were rising. The higher he stood next to Big Paul, the more his own name became attached to that figure in the minds of others. Friends and enemies alike began to see him not just as a driver, but as a gatekeeper. And in his world, the gatekeeper was rarely left alone. Still, at the dinner table, he kept the tone light whenever possible. He made jokes about traffic. He shared sanitized stories from the road, funny moments with gas station attendants or confused tourists asking for directions in the middle of the city. He left out the tense conversations, the quiet meetings, the long silences that carried more weight than arguments. There were moments when the two parts of his life brushed up against each other. A child's school event where he arrived with minutes to spare still in his work suit, the smell of city exhaust clinging to his coat. A parent-teacher meeting where a teacher, noticing his name, raised an eyebrow for a fraction of a second before smoothing it away. Tommy saw all of it. He saw the doubt, the assumptions, the unspoken question, but he also saw the way his children's faces lit up when they spotted him in the crowd. For them, it did not matter who he drove or what whispers followed him outside. What mattered was that he showed up and clapped when their names were called. In quiet, late-night hours, he sometimes wondered if there might have been another path, one where he worked a regular job, came home at the same time every day, shared weekends without interruptions. He knew men who had chosen that route. Some were content. Some stared into their drinks with the hollow eyes of people who felt they had missed their why chance to matter. Tommy could not imagine himself punching a time clock. The same stubborn intensity that made him good at his current life would have made him restless in an office or a factory. He had chosen his road long ago, back when he was a boy, run envelopes and learning which faces mattered. Now, with a family looking to him, there was no turning back. So he did what he could. He built strong walls around his home life, kept his voice gentle when he walked through the front door, tried to leave the weight of Todt Hill at the curb. He was not always successful. There were nights when tension rode in with him, a silent passenger that took a while to shake off. On those nights, his wife would sometimes bring him a plate of leftovers and say nothing, letting the food and the quiet do what words could not. In the end, Tommy's double life was not a dramatic costume change, but a series of careful adjustments. A different tone of voice here, a different set of stories there. A smile saved for his children, a harder expression reserved for men who tested his patience in alleys and back rooms. He knew that balancing act could not last forever. Sooner or later, the pace of the life he had chosen and the needs of the family he loved would collide in ways he could not control. But that knowledge stayed deep in the back of his mind, folded up and set aside like a letter he was not ready to open. For now, he kept walking the tightrope. By day and often by night, he was the steady presence behind the wheel for one of the most powerful men in the city. By evening, when luck and schedules allowed, he was the father crawling on the floor to rebuild a cushioned fortress, and the husband sharing a quiet cup of coffee at a worn kitchen table. In both worlds, he relied on the same simple core: loyalty, to the boss in the big house, to the family in the modest stat, to the rules he had chosen long ago. It was a heavy load for one man to carry, but Tommy Bilotti carried it with the same determined stride he had used as a boy on those creaking staircases, never quite slowing down, never quite letting go. Chapter 5: The Gambino Chessboard. From the back seat of a car, the city looks like a stage that keeps changing sets while the same characters walk through every scene. Tommy spent years watching that stage through the rear-view mirror. Over time, he began to understand that what looked like one big show was really two plays running at the same time. On one side, there was the clean shirt world, men in tailored suits carrying leather briefcases, holding meetings in offices with framed art and quiet carpets. This was the world that Paul Castellano loved. Meat businesses, construction contracts, unions managed from conference tables instead of bar stools. Money came in numbers so large that you stopped saying them out loud. On the other side, there was the street world, social clubs with smoky ceilings, card games that never really ended, men in leather jackets and less polished shoes. This was the world that Agnello della Croce represented. Old school, blue collar, the kind of guys who still like to stand on corners and keep a hand in every small action on the block. The Gambino family lived in the middle of this split, walking a tight line between the two sides. Tommy stood at a strange crossroads. By day he drove Castellano from one white-collar meeting to another, but he had grown up around the older way, the Dockside deals and neighborhood codes. He understood both languages. In the car he listened to conversations that never quite said what they meant. When Castellano talked with his more polished associates, they spoke of investments, percentages, and adjustments. When street captains came around, those same ideas were dressed up as respect, tribute, and tradition. Everyone was talking about the same pile of mun. They just chose their words according to the room. The boss preferred numbers to gunfire, balance sheets to brawls. He liked the kind of control that came from owning the supply chain, from meat packing plants to supermarket shelves. To him, the family was not just a group of tough men. It was a corporation that needed to move forward into a new century. Some of the older guys nodded along with this thinking, but it did not sit easy with everyone. There were men who felt that the boss had floated too far away from the sidewalks that had built the family in the first place. They grumbled in private about fancy houses and whispered that the hill had made him forget the street. From his place behind the wheel, Tommy saw the tension but did not pretend to be a strategist. His job was to move the boss safely from one environment to the other and back again, but he could feel the difference in the air. In midtown offices the talk was smooth, the smiles practiced. In downtown clubs the talk was shorter, the jokes darker, the respect edged with something harder. Names kept turning up. Della Croce, the old underboss, still respected in the street world. His followers downtown, including one name that came up more often as the years passed. John Gotti. People said his name the way you say the name of a man who carries his own weather with him. Some said it with admiration, some with caution, some with both. One afternoon, Tommy drove Castellano to a quiet meeting that included a few key people from both sides. The room was not large, but it felt crowded with reputation. Some men sat stiffly, trying to look comfortable in their suits. Others lounged back with an ease that came from knowing they had built their status the hard way. Tommy stayed outside the main room, in the hall where a side table held a silver coffee pot and delicate cups. He poured for whoever stepped out during breaks, catching fragments of conversation. Words like speculation, indictment, balance, loyalty. No one raised their voice, yet the tension was as plain as the coffee in his hand. He watched faces more than he listened to words. A street captain came out frowning, then forced his expression flat as soon as he saw Tommy. An uptown advisor smoothed his tie a little too often, as if trying to iron out invisible wrinkles. Later, when they were back in the car, Castellano sat silent for several minutes. The city lights flickered over his face while Tommy drove, careful and steady. Finally, the boss spoke, more to himself than to his driver. He said that too many people wanted to be their own bosses, that discipline was slipping. Tommy did not answer. He knew this was not a conversation he could fix with any words of his. Instead, he filed the remark away with all the others. Another piece of the puzzle, another sign that the Gambino chessboard was growing more complicated by the week. The inner workings of the family sometimes reminded him of the games he used to watch in the corner cafe as a boy. The same men showed up every day for cards and coffee, but the alliances shifted with each hand. Here the stakes were higher and the smiles sharper. Everyone claimed to be on the same team, but under the surface each man kept his own score. Tommy, by contrast, kept his score the simple way. Did he do what the boss asked? Did he show up on time? Did he solve problems without creating new ones? That was the extent of his personal ambition. He was not trying to be a king on the board. He was content to be a piece that moved with purpose, so long as he stood close to the king. He knew that some men looked down on him for that. To them, a man without higher ambition was wasting his chances. But Tommy had seen too many meteors burn bright and vanish. Promotions could paint targets. Visibility could invite trouble. There was a certain safety in being essential but not flashy. Still, he was not blind. He saw that the center of gravity in the family was shifting. As law enforcement pressure grew and indictments piled up, the old guard in the street world grew restless. They felt they were taking the hardest hits, while the more refined side of the family tried to keep hands clean and suits spotless. In social clubs, whispers floated about leadership, about decisions, about whether the top man understood what it meant to be out collecting payments in bad weather, while judges read out big sentences in warm courtrooms. Tommy heard those whispers. He also heard the loyalty in certain voices, men who insisted that the boss had earned his place and that discipline meant following the chain of command no matter what. In the middle of all this, his daily life continued. Rides from Staten Island to Manhattan, visits to meat businesses where refrigerated trucks hummed in neat lines, stops at social clubs where the smoke hung heavy and the coffee tasted like burnt patience. He walked through both worlds with equal familiarity. At times he felt like one of those little ferries crossing the harbour over and over. Same path, same water, different passengers. Some days he carried accountants and advisors. Other days he escorted captains who could barely hide their contempt for anything that smelled like corporate vocabulary. And then there were the days when both worlds collided in the same room. A lawyer in a perfect suit sharing a table with a man whose hands were scarred from a lifetime of work, each of them speaking in half sentences and shared glances. Those were the days when Tommy could almost feel the air crackling. He had his own opinions about it all, though he rarely shared them. To him, the divide between white-collar and blue-collar seemed a little artificial. Money was money. Respect was respect. Problems did not care whether you wore silk ties or leather jackets. But he understood that identity mattered. Men who had grown up on the street needed to feel that the street still counted. Men who had grown into boardrooms wanted the dignity of professionalism. Through it all, Castellano trusted him. Trusted that he would not repeat the wrong remark to the wrong person. Trusted that when he sat in the front seat, he was listening more than he talked. The boss valued that steady presence, that reliable bridge between his hilltop home and the noisy city below. As the chessboard grew crowded with plotting minds and restless ambitions, Tommy clung to the simple truth that had carried him this far. Stay loyal, stay calm. Keep the car moving. If the family was going to rearrange itself, that was for others to debate. His responsibility was to keep the man at the center of it all safe and on schedule. He did not yet know that the shifting balance between those two worlds, the clean shirt world and the street world, would soon decide not about promotions and profits, but lives. For now, all he knew was that the rides were growing tenser, the meetings more frequent, and the pauses in conversation inside the car a little heavier with each passing month. The Gambino chessboard was in motion, and Tommy Bilotti sat in the driver's seat, steering through the middle of it, loyal to the king he had chosen, even as other pieces prepared to make their own moves. Chapter 6: Promotion and Pressure. The winter that changed everything began quietly, with cold rain on Staten Island roofs and the usual mix of gossip and routine. For most people, it was just another season. For the world Tommy lived in, it was a time of funerals, promotions, and decisions that would echo louder than anyone expected. Aniello Della Croce had been the bridge between the hill and the street. As underboss, he carried respect in the older corners of the city. Men from the tough neighborhoods saw him as son of their own, someone who had come up the hard way and never forgotten it. Even those who preferred the new corporate style understood that his presence kept certain tempers in check. When word came that Della Croce was gone, his body finally giving out after years of strain, the reaction rippled through the family like a slow wave. On the surface, everyone spoke of loss and respect, of prayers and memories. Underneath, another conversation was already starting, a silent one about what came next. Tommy felt the change more than he heard it. In the days following the underboss's passing, the calls to Todt Hill increased. Captains, advisors, and old allies came and went through the heavy front door. Inside, voices stayed low, but the hours stretched long. The house, usually a place of controlled routine, took on the feel of a command center. He drove back and forth from that house in a steady loop. Some passengers rode in tense silence. Others spoke to him in short, clipped sentences, their minds clearly on the shifting hierarchy. A few tried to mask their excitement. A vacant position at the top meant something for every man below, even those who pretended they had no interest in climbing. Tommy did not see himself in that scramble. His relationship to power had always been indirect. He served it, guarded it, moved it from place to place. That was enough for him. So when the talk in the clubs turned to who would sit where after the dust settled, he listened politely and said very little. The boss, on the other hand, could not afford such distance. Castellano had decisions to make. The underboss slot could not remain empty for long. The family needed a structure it could recognize, a chain of command it could present to friends and enemies alike. Behind closed doors, names were surely discussed. Men with long resumes of service, men with strong support among the street crews, men who would use the position as a platform for their own ambitions. All that calculation happened above Tommy's line of sight. He only saw the results. When the decision came, it raised more than a few eyebrows. The new underboss would not be a downtown legend or a long-standing capo. The new underboss would be the man who had spent near every waking hour at Castellano's side, the one who knew his schedule better than anyone else, the driver, the bodyguard. The name was Tommy's. The day he was told, he felt a strange mixture of pride and something heavier, like a weight placed carefully on his shoulders. He had never chased titles. Now one of the biggest titles in their world was suddenly hanging around his neck. It did not come with balloons or speeches. Castellano spoke to him in private, in a room with thick carpets and closed curtains. He explained that he needed someone close, someone loyal beyond question, someone who understood his way of doing business. He said that trust was worth more than popularity, and that Tommy had earned that trust 100 times over. Tommy listened, heart beating hard but face composed. He answered simply, with words that pledged himself once again to the man he had already chosen long ago. He did not promise to be perfect. He promised to be loyal and to work. When the news reached the wider family, reactions were mixed. Some saw the logic. The boss had elevated the man he felt safest with, someone who would not scheme behind his back or build his own empire. Others were less pleased. To them it felt like a slight against the old order, another sign that street credentials meant less than proximity to the big house. For Tommy, there was little time to dwell on other people's opinions. The promotion changed his daily life in ways both obvious and subtle. Meetings that he would once have waited outside now required his presence at the table. Conversations shifted from instructions given to him to questions directed at him. What do you think we should do here? How would you handle that situation? It was not an easy adjustment. He had spent most of his career moving in the spaces between the top and the bottom, a link rather than a node. Now he was officially part of the top. Men who had once treated him as a respected worker now approached him with more careful smiles, more deliberate words. With the new status came new risks. He became a more visible symbol of the leadership Castellano represented. Those who were already unhappy with the boss now had another name to attach to their dissatisfaction. The underboss slot, once held by a man who commanded nearly universal respect, was now filled by someone closely identified with the white-collar hill. Tommy felt the shift in the way rooms changed when he walked in. Some voices grew louder, as if trying too hard to appear relaxed. Others fell quiet. He had not changed his manner, but the way people read it had changed. The same steady stride now belonged to the underboss, even if he still felt like the driver who happened to be holding a heavier set of keys. At home, the promotion meant very little in the practical sense. There was no extra room built onto the house, no sudden move to some gated estate. The bills were already paid. The kids still needed help with homework, still fought over the television, still complained about bedtimes. His wife, hearing the news in the code of their world, understood the danger before she celebrated the honor. She knew that higher rank in that life did not just mean more income, it meant more attention from law enforcement and more interest from rivals. Her congratulations came with a careful look in her eyes, one that mixed pride and worry in equal measure. Tommy tried to ease her concerns with the same calm he used in the car. He told her that nothing important had changed. He would still do what he had always done, he would still come home when he could, he would still be careful. Inside, he knew that was only partly true. Responsibility had shifted. The family now looked at him not just as the man next to the boss, but as the man who would speak for the boss when needed. If orders were carried out, his name might be the one attached to them in conversations across the city. The weight of that reality settled on him during a late-night drive through Manhattan. The streets were slick with recent rain, reflecting traffic lights in shaky pools of color. In the back seat, Castellano spoke of plans and concerns, of legal troubles and potential arrangements. He spoke to Tommy as an advisor now, not just as a listener. Tommy gave his thoughts carefully. He was not a lawyer or an accountant, but he understood people. He understood which captains could be trusted to carry out complicated instructions without improvising, and which ones needed closer supervision. He knew which neighborhoods were simmering with dissatisfaction and which ones remained steady. The pressure did not announce itself in loud moments. It showed up in the quiet ones. At night, when the house was still and the only sound was the refrigerator humming in the kitchen, he lay awake thinking about the many angles of every decision made on that hill. A wrong call could mean prison for some, disaster for others. In extreme cases, it could mean someone being unalived. He did not romanticize it. The life was not a movie to him. It was a network of real people with real families, all tied together by a system that rewarded loyalty and punished weakness. As underboss, he was now part of the machinery that made that system run. He knew that outside their circle another kind of pressure was building. Investigations grew deeper. Cases piled up. Prosecutors began to speak about organizations in new ways, painting them with broad strokes, naming names in courtrooms where reporters filled every bench. In that climate, a tight, disciplined leadership was more important than ever. Castellano believed that his way, the business-focused way, would keep the family strong and less exposed. Many of his moves were aimed at cutting down on loud violence and replacing it with silent control. But not everyone shared that patience. Downtown, in the clubs and on the corners, some men saw these changes as weakness. They felt that the boss cared more about his legitimate companies than about the men who spent their nights under neon lights watching for unmarked cars. Tommy found himself in the uncomfortable position of being the most visible symbol of Castellano's style. He was the loyal soldier promoted for that very loyalty. To men who did not share the boss's vision, that promotion was proof that there would be no compromise. He heard the murmurs, some subtle, some less so. They called him Big Paul's shadow, his echo, his shield. Some intended these labels as praise, others as criticism. Tommy accepted them all with the same steady expression. He had made his choice long ago. His future was tied completely to the man on the hill. In rare moments of private reflection, he wondered how different his life might have been if he had kept a little more distance. If he had remained a respected driver, a reliable helper, not a named figure at the very top. But such thoughts did not linger long. In his world, wandering was a luxury. Decisions were made, roads taken, and you drove them until the end. In the weeks after his promotion, the air around the family grew thicker with rumors. There were whispers of plans being made without the boss's knowledge, of meetings held in back rooms without his blessing. Names like John Gotti floated more often through those whispers, attached to words like restless and ambitious. Tommy heard enough to know that something was moving beneath the surface, but not enough to see the exact shape of it. He was busy managing errands from the top, busy calming smaller disputes before they grew, busy riding shotgun in a life that had suddenly turned the volume up. From the seat behind the wheel, the streets of New York looked the same as they always had. Traffic still clogged the same corners, buses still hissed at the curb, steam still rose from manhole covers on cold nights, but inside the cars and clubs, Inside the conversations that never made the newspapers, the pressure was building quietly. Promotion had given Tommy a higher seat at the table. It had also moved him closer to the edge of whatever storm was forming. He sensed it in the way people paused before answering simple questions, in the way certain invitations were worded, in the way the boss occasionally stared out of car windows, as if trying to read not at the buildings, but the thoughts of everyone in them. Tommy did what he had always done. He showed up. He drove. He listened. He followed the man he had chosen, even as the roads grew narrower and more crowded with unseen dangers. He had been underboss for only a short time, barely enough for the title to feel fully real, when fate decided to call in all the debts at once. But for that brief period, between the funeral of one underboss and the last drive of another, he carried the weight with the same determined stride that had carried him from Dockside errands to Todt Hill. Chapter 7. The Last Ordinary Days. December in New York has a particular kind of cold. It is not just the temperature. It is the way the wind swings around corners and finds the gap between your collar and your neck. The way the sky hangs low and grey over the bridges. The way the city dresses itself in lights and decorations, while everyone pretends they are not counting money or watching their backs. For Tommy, that winter had the usual mix of routine and unease. Streets he knew by heart were draped in holiday lights. Store windows tried their best to look cheerful with plastic snow and fake reindeer. Staten Island houses put up their own displays, some tasteful, some enthusiastic to the point of comedy. Kids talked about presents and vacations. Adults talked about sales and overtime. In the Bilotti house, the season felt almost normal. His kids wrote careful letters to Santa, lists full of hopes that ranged from simple toys to things that sounded more like small engineering projects. His wife juggled school events, family visits, and grocery trips that seemed to grow heavier with each passing trip. There were arguments about which night to decorate the tree and whether tinsel was worth the mess. Tommy tried to be present for the small rituals. He wound lights around the tree with a level of focus that would not have looked out of place on a stakeout. He lifted kids up so they could place ornaments in high spots, even when those ornaments ended up crooked. He sat at the table as they argued about which holiday movie was the best, and pretended to be a neutral judge. But the phone did not take a vacation. Calls still came at odd hours, cutting through the soft glow of family evenings like cold air through a drafty window. Work, as always, did not care about school schedules or holiday plans. The mood within the Gambino circles that December was complicated. The old underboss was gone. The new one, Tommy himself, was still adjusting to the role, even as the family adjusted to him. Castellano remained focused on business, on keeping the company side of their world running smoothly despite courtroom pressures and newspaper headlines. Downtown, in the clubs and bars where the street wing gathered, conversations had grown more pointed. Men who had once swallowed their complaints now let them hover closer to the surface. Some spoke openly of being unhappy with the Hill. Others, more cautious, spoke in half-phrases and unfinished sentences. Tommy did not sit in those rooms for long chats, but he felt the change. A look here, a tone there, a greeting that used to be warm, now slightly cooler. Nothing sharp enough to call out directly, but noticeable to a man who spent his life reading people in mirrors and shadows. In the car with Castellano, the routine remained much the same. Early departures from Todt Hill, trips into Manhattan to take care of business, visits to offices where December meant year-end numbers and careful planning for the new year. The city itself seemed to move in slow motion. Holiday shoppers clogged the sidewalks, bundled in heavy coats, arms full of bags. Street vendors added seasonal decorations to their carts and doubled their patience. Taxi horns sounded more often as drivers battled both traffic and distracted pedestrians. One evening, as they crept through midtown traffic, Castellano watched the crowds with a thoughtful expression. He made a calm remark about how people spent more in December than they could afford, and spent January pretending they were surprised by the bills. The comment carried a dry humor that made Tommy smile despite the long day. The calendar filled with meetings. Some were business as usual. Others felt heavier, the kind of sit-downs where voices dropped and certain names were handled carefully. Tommy was not told everything, but he could read the outlines. There were concerns about law enforcement attention, concerns about loyalty, concerns about the direction certain downtown figures seemed to be leaning. At home, hints of that pressure appeared in small ways. Tommy came back later, slept less, stared at the television without really seeing what was on the screen. His wife noticed, of course. After so many years, she could read his moods with little effort. She asked a few gentle questions, but mostly she let him sit with his thoughts, offering coffee or a hand on his shoulder rather than demands for explanations he could not honestly give. The meeting at Sparks' Steakhouse arrived on the schedule like just another line in a busy week. Sparks was not new to them. A midtown steakhouse, popular and busy, the kind of place where men in suits spent long lunches talking about deals while pretending to talk about the menu. For Castellano, it was a familiar spot. For Tommy, it was another destination to be folded into route calculations and timing. He knew the block, he knew the patterns of traffic around it. He knew that the early evening in Midtown could be a mess of taxis and delivery trucks, and people rushing from work to dinner reservations. The date on the calendar was mid-December, a Monday. A work day dressed up in lights. There was no thunderclap, no ominous music, just another line in a year that had already seen more than its share of tension. In the days leading up to it, Tommy's life was full of the usual details. One afternoon he had to navigate around a sudden road closure that turned a simple drive into a slow crawl. Another day he spent nearly an hour waiting outside an office where the boss was locked in a long discussion with lawyers. He tried to keep his mind clear and his routines tight. He checked the car more carefully than ever. Mirrors, tires, lights, everything that could help him keep the boss safe. He watched faces on sidewalks, noting who seemed to be lingering too long, who seemed to be paying more attention than they should. He was not the only one watching. Unknown to him, other men had begun their own season of observation. Cars parked where they could see who came and went from Todt Hill. Men sitting in diners with coffee that was more excuse than refreshment, eyes tracking license plates and schedules, downtown figures measuring the movements of the hill not in gossip, but in actual comings and goings. Tommy moved through this growing web with the same deliberate care he had always used. To him, caution was habit, not paranoia. He had been careful long before the atmosphere turned electric. Now that carefulness looked almost prophetic. One evening he stood by the kitchen window of his own house, looking out at the cold street while his family moved around behind him. The tree lights blinked lazily. The faint smell of sauce lingered in the air. His kids argued softly in the next room about who had cheated in a board game. He watched the lights of a passing car slide across the snow-dusted pavement and felt a strange mixture of comfort and unease. Comfort because he was home, for the moment. Unease because home felt more and more like a brief stop between runs instead of a destination. Still, he kept his worries under control. That was his way. He did not panic. He did not call everyone into a room and give speeches. He simply prepared. He double-checked his routines. He sharpened his focus. He slept when he could, despite the restless thoughts that crept in around the edges of his mind. The last ordinary days were never announced as such. They looked like many other days. Morning coffee in a kitchen warmed by the smell of toast. Quick kisses at the door. A drive up Todt Hill with the winter sky still pale. A day spent moving in and out of offices and social clubs and quiet restaurants where business was conducted between bites. If someone had asked Tommy then if he felt a turning point coming, he might have said that things were tense, yes, but tension was nothing new. The life always had pressure. The life always had grudges and calculations. What he could not see was how close all those separate pressures had come to a single point, like traffic merging from many lanes into one. Plans had been made without his knowledge, decisions taken in rooms where he was not present, by men who no longer believed that the hill and the street could share the same future. To Tommy, the approaching dinner at Sparks was another responsibility to handle correctly, another ride to plan, another evening to keep the boss safe and on time. He thought of routes and timing, of where to park and how to position the car. He did not think of it as an ending. The city around him carried on, unaware or pretending to be. Taxi drivers complained about fares. Store owners counted the last receipts of the day. Office workers headed into the cold night in search of warm food and maybe a drink before home. A million small stories crossed and recrossed each other, none aware that one particular car and one particular passenger list would soon become the center of every headline. In those last ordinary days, Tommy Bilotti did exactly what he had always done. He kept the car running. He watched the streets. He served the boss he had chosen. The calm routines of his life rolled forward, steady and practiced, right up to the curb outside Sparks Steakhouse. Chapter 8. Sparks Steakhouse. The morning of the Sparks dinner began like many other winter mornings on Staten Island. The sky was a color somewhere between steel and smoke. The air carried the smell of distant water and closer chimneys. In the Bilotti house, the day started with clatter and voices, kids hunting for missing socks and arguing about breakfast choices. Tommy moved through it with his usual mix of affection and impatience. He poured coffee, kissed foreheads, reminded Dunchild to grab a homework folder that had tried to escape behind a chair. His wife handed him a sandwich wrapped in wax paper, with the quiet efficiency of someone who knew his schedule better than he sometimes did. There was nothing in his manner to suggest that this day would be different from any other long work day. He checked his watch, spoke into the phone in short phrases, and straightened his tie in the hallway mirror. His reflection looked like the same man he saw every morning. Sharp suit, set jaw, eyes that had seen a great deal and planned to see more. The drive up Todt Hill was familiar. The houses sat quiet in the cold, lawns trimmed even in winter, cars parked in neat rows. The gate to Castellano's house opened after the usual pause. The houseman gave Tommy the same nod as always, respectful and efficient. Inside, the household moved with practiced rhythm. When the boss emerged, he looked as he usually did. Heavy coat, measured step, the quiet authority of a man accustomed to being the center of gravity wherever he went. Tommy opened the car door, watched him settle into the back seat, and took his place behind the wheel. They had places to be before Sparks. Business had its own calendar, and the day was already full before dinner ever came up. The car moved from Staten Island into Brooklyn, then toward Manhattan, merging into the river of traffic that flowed toward the heart of the city. In the back seat, Castellano handled calls and paperwork. He spoke in his calm voice about shipments, contracts, legal problems that needed careful handling. Tommy navigated through the tangle of highways and bridges, eyes flicking from mirrors to lanes to the distant glint of skyline. The city wrapped around them. Trucks rumbled alongside. Taxis darted in and out with more enthusiasm than caution. A light frost on the pavement caught the morning sun and turned certain corners bright for a second at a time. It was a regular New York workday, noisy and indifferent to the specific men passing through it. As the hours went by, the day folded into its usual pattern. Meetings in rooms with long tables, discussions that stretched just a little longer than scheduled, coffee that never tasted quite as good as what Tommy's wife brewed at home. At one point between appointments, Castellano mentioned the dinner more directly. "Sparks," he said, expecting the usual mix of business and steak. To him it seemed like another obligation to fit into a crowded calendar. To Tommy it was a destination to be measured in blocks and traffic lights. He thought through the route in his head, from the bridge into Manhattan, across busy avenues, then to the Midtown block where Sparks sat with its bright neon sign and constant churn of cabs and customers. He had done it before. He knew where the traffic tended to slow, where the lane changes were trickiest, where parking could be tight. Later in the afternoon they headed toward Midtown. The sky was already starting to dim, that early winter twilight that arrives before most people feel ready for it. Office windows glowed against the grey. Streams of people flowed along the sidewalks, shoulders hunched, eyes set on distant doors and promised warmth. In the car, the mood was serious but not tense. Castellano reviewed a few points for the evening, more about business than about danger. If he had any unease, he did not show it. Tommy kept his own thoughts focused on the practical, timing, street positions, the best spot to pull up near the front door without blocking too much traffic. They reached the block where Sparks sat. Neon letters announced the restaurant to the world, though the sign itself blurred into the larger glow of midtown lights. The glass frontage reflected passing cars and bundled up pedestrians. Inside, diners were already settling into tables, menus unfolding like small paper shields against the winter night. Tommy slowed the car, checking mirrors, identifying places to stop. Traffic was its usual mess. Cabs rocketed through gaps that barely existed. A delivery truck sat half over a lane, daring anyone to object. Horns sounded in impatient bursts that had nothing to do with the significance of this particular car. He pulled up near the entrance, choosing a spot that gave them an easy path to the door without blocking more than he had to. The engine idled with a low, steady hum. Streetlights painted the hood of the car in thin stripes of white and shadow. For a moment there was stillness inside the car. The noise of the street pressed against the windows without fully intruding. Castellano gathered his coat around him, readying himself for the brief walk from car door to restaurant entrance, the short public stretch between controlled spaces. Tommy stepped out into the cold. The air bit at his face and turned his breath into faint clouds. He moved around the front of the car toward the passenger side, the way he had done countless times before, intending to open the door and fall into his usual position slightly behind and to the side of the boss. On that sidewalk, in those few seconds, many separate stories collided. Men who had been watching schedules from a distance were now close. They knew the timing, they knew the place. They knew that this short walk from car to restaurant would be the point where routine could be broken. What happened next unfolded too fast for any slow description to match the reality. For witnesses, it later came back as flashes, the sudden movement of figures that had seemed part of the crowd, the brief, terrible noise, the burst of chaos in a space that had looked moments earlier like just another restaurant entrance on just another midtown evening. For Tommy, sensations would have come in layers. The scrape of shoes on pavement, the sting of cold air in his lungs, the awareness of the boss beside him, of the door, of the angle of the sidewalk, and then the impact of a moment in which all the careful routines of his life were shattered at once. In the space of a heartbeat, the partnership between driver and boss, between underboss and boss, between Tommy and Big Paul, came to an end on that cold sidewalk. There were no speeches, no last word, just the brutal finality of a plan carried out by men who had decided that the hill and the street could not continue under the same leader. Sirens followed as they always do when order breaks. People shouted and ducked. Cars tried to push past the scene and then gave up as the street locked into gridlock. Some witnesses froze, staring. Others ran. Inside Sparks, diners who had been thinking only of salads and steaks suddenly found themselves pressed against windows or crouched behind tables. Outside, lights began to multiply. Police, ambulances, television vans. The sidewalk that had been just another sliver of city ground became a border between before and after. News travelled fast. Within minutes, radios crackled with updates. Within an hour, the story started appearing on television screens across the city. The names were familiar. The setting was dramatic enough to hold even the most casual viewer's attention. The words boss and underboss were repeated with the kind of fascinated tone reserved for crime stories that sound too cinematic to be entirely real. For Tommy, there was no after in the usual sense. His last act of service had been to bring the car to that curb and to step out into the cold air, ready to walk beside his boss the more time. His loyalty had carried him to that exact spot. It did not carry him back. The city, however, did what cities always do. It absorbed the shock and kept moving. Streets had to be cleared, traffic had to resume, tables at Sparks would eventually be filled again. People would walk past that restaurant and think about their own dinners, their own deadlines, their own lives. Within the world Tommy belonged to, the event was more than a headline. It was a transfer of power written in the harshest ink. The family now faced a future without the man from the hill, and without the driver who had been his shadow. New leaders would step forward, new rules would be made, new alliances would form. But on that evening itself, amid the flashing lights and drifting sirens, all of that still lay ahead. What lay on the sidewalk was the sudden end of a particular story. The story of a Staten Island kid who had carried groceries up creaking stairs, run envelopes for older men, learned the language of favors, and eventually found himself at the side of one of the most powerful figures in New York. In his final moments, there was no time for reflection, so the reflection falls to those who tell the story afterward: the reporters, the lawmen, the historians, the neighbors, and the quiet narrators who sit awake at night and think about men who choose lives that rarely end peacefully. The sidewalk outside Sparks cooled as the night deepened. Eventually the crowd thinned. The restaurant lights stayed on, too bright against the dark. Somewhere across the river, on Staten Island, a family waited for news that every part of them dreaded and expected at the same time. For years afterward, people would talk about that evening. Top men would discuss it in clubs and offices. Ordinary New Yorkers would recall where they were when they heard. Some would focus on Castellano, the boss whose name had dominated headlines. Others, more quietly, would mention Tommy, the loyal man at his side, whose story ended at the same curb but whose name often settled into the second paragraph. In the calm after the sirens faded, when the last of the equipment had been packed away and the street began to look like itself again, the city exhaled and moved on. That is what cities do. What remained, for those who knew him, was the memory of a man who had lived his life in service to a code he believed in, however flawed the world around it might have been. A man whose last day followed his usual path, from Staten Island to the Hill to Manhattan, until routine and fate collided outside a midtown steakhouse. Chapter 9: Aftermath and the Forgotten Man. News travels differently depending on who you are. For most New Yorkers, the story arrived through television screens that night: a serious-looking anchor, a photograph of a heavy-set man in a suit, a grainy shot of a crowded sidewalk in front of a midtown restaurant. Words like organized crime and boss and underworld were repeated with the slow emphasis of people who enjoyed the drama without wanting to get too close. In those first reports, the focus was clear. The cameras loved a headline, and the headline was Castellano. His name filled the screen. His past was unrolled like a highlight reel. Meat businesses, alleged rackets, court cases, Todt Hill. Somewhere in the middle of those reports, usually after a pause for effect, another name appeared: the second man, the driver, the underboss, Thomas Bilotti. He was often a supporting character in someone else's tragedy, a second face in a story about the fall of a boss. A second face in a story about the fall of a boss. In the world Tommy had actually lived in, the news did not need anchors or graphics. It arrived in ringing phones, hurried knocks on doors, unfinished drinks left on tables in clubs where the television volume was turned up for once. It arrived as a tightening in the chest of men who had been expecting something big, but still felt their throats go dry when something big finally happened. On Staten Island, the shock landed with a heavier thud. This was not just a headline about some distant figure in Manhattan. This was about a man people had grown up with, a kid they had seen running errands, now named as a top figure in the largest family in the city. And now he was gone, in the same instant as his boss, on a sidewalk that many of them had walked in less dramatic shoes. At the Bilotti house, the evening took on a strange, suspended quality. The television spoke in that polished, distant voice that always made tragedy sound like an interesting program. Images flickered across the screen. The restaurant front, police tape, reporters trying to look both respectful and excited. Family members gathered slowly, pulled together by calls and instinct. Some had heard the news already, others arrived still hoping there had been a mistake. The kids sensed something was wrong before they understood the words. Children are good at reading the room. Voices were hushed, faces were drawn. Grown-ups moved with a distracted urgency that did not match any normal holiday rush. For his wife, the night was a collision between fear long carried and reality finally arrived. She had always known what his life could lead to. Any woman married into that world knew it, even if she refused to spell it out. The late-night phone calls, the sudden departures, the stories in the papers about men who never came home. These were not unfamiliar concepts. They were shadows at the edge of every happy scene. Still, Knowing something is possible is different from watching it crawl across the television with your husband's name attached. She listened as reporters mispronounced his name, as commentators tried to summarize his life in a few brief phrases, as if any of them had ever sat in her kitchen or watched him help with homework at the table. The children did not understand all the details, but they understood enough. The words "gone" and "never coming back" are simple, but they cut deep. Adults tried to shield them with gentle explanations, careful phrasing that softened the edges without lying entirely. They spoke of an accident, of a bad thing that had happened, of a world outside their home that had finally shown its teeth. Before long the house filled with visitors. Some were relatives, faces known and comforting. Others were men from the life, dressed in dark suits, carrying themselves with the restrained gravity of people who have attended too many wakes. They offered condolences in low voices, murmured words about respect and loyalty, and then stepped back to make room for others. In the press, the story moved at a different speed. Reporters rushed to piece together timelines. They interviewed witnesses who seemed to remember more with each retelling. They dug up old photographs, pulled files, called law enforcement sources who were only too happy to add their own commentary. Articles and broadcasts painted Tommy's portrait with broad strokes. Underboss, enforcer, right-hand man. Some called him a feared figure. Others focused on his loyalty, his closeness to Castellano. Very few mentioned the man who sat on the floor building cushion forts with his kids, or the husband who quietly drank late-night coffee at a worn kitchen table. For law enforcement, the event was both a crisis and an opportunity. On one hand, it was proof that the family they had pursued for years was willing to settle internal disputes in the loudest possible way. On the other, it offered a chance to argue for more resources, more investigations, more sweeping cases. Tommy's name turned up in those discussions in a blunt, transactional way. He was data now, a piece of evidence that the organization's leadership had been dramatically rearranged. His decades of small choices, his careful routines, all of it reduced to a line or two in official summaries. The funeral arrangements moved forward with the inevitability of old rituals. Staten Island, with its long history of families like his, knew how these things went. Funeral homes prepared rooms. Cars were lined up with quiet efficiency. Flowers arrived in heavy, fragrant waves. At the wake, people came in steady streams. Some knew him as Tom from the block, some as Mr. Bilotti, some as Tommy, the man you did not want to disappoint. They lined up, shook hands, embraced family members, and moved slowly past the casket with expressions that carried more than words could easily convey. Out on the street, cameras kept their distance, but not too much distance. Telephoto lenses sought glimpses of who came and went. Reporters whispered to each other when they recognized familiar faces from old photographs and case files. For them, it was a chance to fill their coverage with speculation and subtext. For the family inside, it was simply grief. Tucked into all those conversations were uneven memories. Some remembered Tommy as a tough man with a quick temper, the kind of person whose presence could quiet a room even before he said a word. Others remembered him as a kid in hand-me-down clothes, running errands and trying not to spill whatever was in the bag. The younger generation, especially those born after his rise, knew him more as a figure talked about in coded phrases. They heard fragments of stories about his loyalty to the boss, about how close he was to real power. Now they saw the end of that path laid out in a long room, under soft lighting that made everyone's eyes look tired. At the cemetery, the ground waited cold and stubborn. Moravian Cemetery had seen many burials, from ordinary Staten Islanders to more famous names. Tombstones stood in their silent grid, each one carrying a name and a pair of dates that never told the whole story. When it was Tommy's turn to join that quiet neighborhood, the air was still. Words were spoken, some religious, some personal. People shifted on their feet in the cold. Breath rose in small clouds. Somewhere not far off, traffic moved along in its usual patterns, a reminder that the city did not pause easily for anyone. He was laid to rest not far from the man he had served so faithfully. 2 names, 2 stories, closely linked in life and now in death, etched into stone a short walk apart. Visitors who came to see Todt could not help but notice the other. It was a fitting symmetry for a partnership that had defined his final years. In the weeks that followed, headlines moved on. New stories crowded the front pages. Politics, finance, other crimes. The world's attention span shifted, as it always does. Castellano's name remained in the history of organized crime, in documentaries and books. Tommy's name appeared alongside it, often as a secondary note. The loyal underboss. The driver. The other man at Sparks. Within the family, however, his absence was felt differently. His roles had to be filled. The territories he had watched over required new oversight. The lines of communication he had maintained needed new hands. Quiet meetings took place to decide who would take what, who would speak for whom, how the new order would be arranged. Men who had once called him for help now found themselves calling other numbers. Debts owed to him were recalculated or reassigned. The machinery of the life did not pause for mourning. It adjusted, as it always had, making room for new players while the old ones settled into the footnotes. At home, the adjustments were more painful and far less tidy. His wife had to become both mother and father. There were bills to manage, children to comfort, practical details to handle in the middle of grief that never seemed to arrive at a convenient time. She learned how the world reacted to a widow in her position. Some people leaned in with real compassion, bringing food, help, and patient company. Some kept their distance, nervous about being too closely associated with a family that had been splashed across crime headlines. Others tried to turn conversations into confessionals, fishing for stories they could retell later. The children, for their part, had to grow up a little faster than they should have. They had to learn how to carry their father's name in a city that recognized it, sometimes for the wrong reasons. Some classmates would whisper, others would stare. A few would just ask blunt questions that only kids could ask. Over time they developed their own ways of coping. Some leaned into silence, refusing to discuss it at all. Others became storytellers, recounting memories of their father in the kitchen, their father fixing something in the yard, their father cheering from the stands, choosing those images as their internal truth over whatever the newspapers had printed. In certain clubs and back rooms where the life continued with new leaders, old-timers would occasionally mention Tommy in low voices. They remembered his loyalty, his temper, his reliability. Some said he should have been kept further from the top, that his closeness to Castellano had put him in the path of a storm that might otherwise have passed him by. Others argued that he would never have accepted that distance. He was not built to stand halfway. Those debates never lasted long. New problems always demanded attention. New grudges, new schemes, new negotiations. That was the curse and comfort of their world. Even the most dramatic endings were eventually filed away as part of the larger story. In quieter circles, away from the bright lights of both law enforcement and the life, there were people who carried a more personal memory. A butcher who remembered Tommy making sure a supplier did not cut corners. A dock worker who remembered him keeping a dispute from becoming something uglier. A neighbor who remembered him helping carry a couch up a flight of stairs without being asked twice. These small memories rarely made it into books or programs. They lived in casual remarks over coffee, in stories told at family gatherings, in the thoughts of people who found themselves thinking of him when they drove past certain corners or heard a ship horn over the harbour. History loves the big names, the bosses and the rebels. It is not as patient with the men who stand beside them, even when those men hold doors, steer cars and keep schedules that make the whole machine run. In the official record, Tommy Bilotti often remained what he was at Sparks in the eyes of the public. The second man. The driver. But in the hearts of those who had known him all the way from creaking staircases to hilltop driveways, he was more than that. He was a son, a husband, a father, a friend, and a man who had chosen his path early and walked it all the way to its unforgiving end. The aftermath passed, as aftermaths do. The city shifted its attention. The family reassembled under new banners. The house on Staten Island learned how to sound different without his footsteps in the hallway. What remained was quieter than any headline. It was the simple, stubborn memory of a man whose story had been folded into someone else's in the public eye, but who, in the private corners of Staten Island and beyond, would always be remembered on his own terms. Chapter 10. A Quiet Legacy. Years have a way of softening sharp edges. The loudest noises of bed decade begin to sound like distant echoes in the next. New scandals, new headlines, new names rise and fall. The city never stops adding fresh layers to its history. On Staten Island, though, time moves a little differently. Streets hold on to their stories for a long while. Houses remember who lived in them. Certain corners seem to carry the mood of past events, even when the storefronts have changed and the old social clubs have turned into something else. The house where Tommy once lived became, in time, just another house on a quiet block. Another driveway, another lawn, another set of windows catching the afternoon light. New owners moved in, carrying new furniture, new hopes, new habits. The walls that had once heard late-night phone calls and children's laughter now heard different conversations, different worries. If the new residents ever knew the full history of their home, they did not speak of it often. Maybe they heard the name from a neighbour, mentioned casually over a fence. Maybe they looked it up one evening after a stray piece of gossip. Maybe they only knew that long before them, someone important in a certain world had parked his car in that driveway and walked those same steps to the front door. Down the road, in Moravian Cemetery, the stone with Tommy's name aged slowly. Rain streaked it, moss edged its corners, leaves gathered around it in autumn, and snow softened its lines in winter. Visitors came and went. Some stood long and quiet, others stayed only a moment, leaving behind a gesture more than a full visit. Not far away, the stone for Castellano stood with its own gravity. 2 names, 2 lives intertwined in the public record and in the private memories of a shrinking group of people who had known them both. The paths between those stones were worn smoother than others, a sign that some visitors made it a point to stop at each in turn. Once in a while an old associate would shuffle along those paths, hands in coat pockets, breath clouding in the cold air. He would stand by Tommy's resting place and talk in a low voice, as if the man underneath might still be listening. The stories told in those moments were rarely about business. They were about the small episodes that had stuck in the storyteller's mind. The time Tommy drove through a blizzard to make sure a meeting happened on schedule. The time he stepped between 2 men on the edge of doing something foolish and defused the situation with a sharp word and a look. The way he always seemed to know when someone needed a quiet show of support. In surviving social clubs, where the furniture had aged and the coffee had stayed stubbornly the same, his name came up less often as the years went by. Younger members, born after his time, knew him mostly as a figure in stories. Older men corrected their exaggerated versions now and then, trimming away the myths and bringing the man back into focus. They remembered his temper, sure, that was part of the man, and no one who had dealt with him honestly pretended otherwise. But they also remembered his humour, the dry remarks he would drop when he felt the room needed to breathe, the way he could make a long drive feel shorter by pointing out the strange habits of different neighbourhoods, not in a cruel way, but with the observational eye of someone who had spent his life watching from just behind the front line. In the broader world, his legacy was more complicated. Law enforcement histories and crime books often presented him as a cautionary figure, a reminder of what happens when you bind your fate completely to someone else's. They noted that his rise to underboss had been swift, and that his time in that role had been brutally short. Some analysts argued that he was in the wrong place at the wrong time, a loyal soldier caught in a war between different visions of the family. Others argued that in a life built on such sharp divisions, his place had always been destined to end at a point like Sparks. There were plenty of theories, most of them written by people who had never once ridden with him in the quiet of an early morning or shared a late-night coffee in a quiet kitchen. Away from those analyses, in small apartments and houses across Staten Island and Brooklyn, people remembered him in simpler ways. A cousin's friend, a neighbour's brother, the uncle who once showed up at a family party with gifts that seemed a little too generous for whatever official job he was said to have. For his children, his legacy was not an abstract discussion. It was the sound of his voice in old memories, the smell of his cologne on a carefully folded shirt, the snapshots tucked into drawers and albums. They had to carry his name through a world that often recognized it for reasons that had nothing to do with birthdays or bedtime stories. As they grew older, they had to decide how to answer the quiet question that inevitably followed that recognition. Some chose to speak openly about him, sharing both the good and the difficult, treating him as a complex human being rather than a legend or a villain. Others preferred to say little, guarding their memories as something private, not to be tossed into debates among strangers. The city around them changed. Old clubs closed, new businesses opened. Neighborhoods that had once been full of familiar faces became something else entirely. But the stories about men like Tommy lingered, floating in the air of certain corners, waiting to be picked up by anyone willing to listen. If you stood at a Staten Island diner long enough, you might hear his name, maybe from a retired dock worker on his third cup of coffee, maybe from a former driver who remembered watching him back a car into a tight space without breaking a sweat. The stories would not always be flattering, they would not always be fair, but they would be real in the way that only lived memories can be. In the end, his legacy settled into a kind of calm, not glorified, not entirely condemned. A man who made choices, who stuck to them, who paid the price that life often demands of those who tie their loyalty to powerful figures. A man who tried to hold together two worlds, the hill and the street, the work and the home, the boss's needs and his children's bedtime. The quiet reflection of his life raises questions that reach beyond his particular story. What does loyalty mean when it leads you into danger? How much of a life is yours to control once you step onto a path built on unwritten rules and unspoken threats? Is it better to be the man who stands at the center, making the big decisions, or the one who stands beside him, carrying out those decisions with steady hands? There are no easy answers, not in his world, not in any world where power and risk walk side by side. But thinking about men like Tommy invites a softer kind of consideration. Instead of seeing only the labels, you see the young kid running up creaking stairs, the driver checking his mirrors, the father straightening a crooked ornament on the family tree. If there is a lesson in his story for restless minds listening in the dark, it may be this. The choices you make about who you stand beside and what you are willing to do for them will shape your life more than any title ever could. Loyalty is a powerful virtue, but it deserves careful aim. Tied to the wrong future, it can carry you very far and still leave you with little room to turn back. Yet even in a life tilted toward danger, there is room for small acts of grace. For the way he tried to keep his work away from his children's ears, for the way he helped neighbors without turning every favor into a transaction, for the way he managed to keep laughing in quiet moments even as the pressure around him grew. In the calm of a late night, if you imagine him sitting once more at that kitchen table, a glass in hand, listening to the refrigerator hum and the house settle, you can almost hear the thoughts that might have drifted through his mind. Regrets, perhaps, pride, certainly, worries about the future, gratitude for the family sleeping in the next rooms. Time has folded his story into the larger fabric of a city that never stops weaving new tales. But somewhere between the headlines and the hushed recollections, the figure of Thomas Bilotti remains. Not just as the second name in a famous event, but as a whole person, full of contradictions and convictions, who walked his chosen road with a determined stride. And so when we think about him now, from a calm distance, we can allow the story to end not on the cold sidewalk in front of a steakhouse, but in a quieter place. Perhaps in the memory of Staten Island at dusk, harbour sounds in the distance, kids playing on the street, and a younger Tommy walking home with a bag of groceries, already feeling the pull of a life that would ask more from him than it ever intended to give back. His journey is over, his choices fixed in time, his name carved into stone. What remains for us is the reflection, the chance to look at his path and ask ourselves where our own loyalties lie, and how we will balance ambition, duty, and the people waiting for us at home. In that sense, his legacy reaches beyond the world he served. It becomes a nighttime story, told in a calm voice, meant not to glorify or to excuse, but simply to understand a little better how a boy from Staten Island became the man beside the boss, and what it cost him in the end.